Welcome to episode 16 of The Pulpiteer. I'm your host, Eric Hepburn, and I'm glad to have you join us for today's episode. Today's podcast is entitled, New Blessings, Wiser Blessing. This week is another live recording. Let's start with a reading from Father Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. In our century, we have seen millions give themselves to ideologies of communism, fascism, terrorism, and unfettered capitalism. Yes, Wall Street is also an embodiment of our ideology. Often in angry rebellion against an oppressive container or because they were given no soulful container at all. Like never before, we are now seeing the misplaced anger that was at the bottom of many, if not most, of the social movements of our age. Building on such a negative foundation inevitably produces a negative building. None of these isms ever create a civilization of love or even positive energy. They are largely theories in the head and come from the small egoic personality, leaving the soul bereft, starved, and saddened outside. Without elders, much of our history has been formed by juniors, reacting, overreacting, and protecting their own temporary privilege with no deep time vision, like the Iroquois nation, which considered what would be good for the next 7 generations. Good morning. 3rd time. 3 times I said good morning. My wife, I do that to my wife too. I just don't want you guys to feel like you're too special. She's like, why do you say good morning to me 4 times a morning? There's not enough of wishing you to have a good day. That's just an excuse for me maybe being forgetful, I'm not sure. So over the summer, I did a sermon series that was based off of an invocation or a benediction that a former minister of mine used to use. And it went something like this. May you find questions more profound than answers, vulnerability more powerful than strength, and a peace that passeth all understanding. So we did some live Q&A sermons with me sitting here in this chair talking about those 3 themes. But I'll tell you, I encountered that benediction, which Reverend Laura was rightfully proud of, about a dozen years ago, and there's always been a little piece of it that just didn't quite sit right with me. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit today, and I've got a new version to share with you. We'll figure out if I made progress or regressed. So the thing that never sat right with me about it was this idea of vulnerability more powerful than strength. And what didn't resonate with me about it after spending a lot of time studying the work of Brené Brown was that I think most of us, when we hear strength in that phrase, we're re-legitimizing this false near-enemy version of strength. Like, we are usually envisioning a kind of strength. Like, the word is too big, right? It draws too big a circle of the Venn diagram, and inside that Venn diagram of what we culturally think of as strength are too many things that are masquerading as strength but aren't true strength, right? Like being physically able. I mean, that is a kind of strength, but I don't think it's one that is evoked by the opposite of vulnerability, right? And so we're going to dig into that a little deeper, but first, before we do that, I'm going to share with you my new version, and then we'll talk through it a bit. May you find questions more profound than answers, play more proficient than mastery, vulnerability more powerful than invincibility, supplication more productive than control, and a peace that passeth all understanding. Now, having been a furniture designer for many years, I do understand that I've made a 3-legged stool, a 5-legged stool, which has some negative unintended consequences for stability, especially if you put wheels on the bottom of it. But I want to start here. So I was, at the beginning of this month, I was up in Canada at the Orphan Wisdom School. And I was working with an author and activist who was just acknowledged by Harvard Divinity School as one of their most impactful graduates over the last 20 years. His name's Stephen Jenkinson. He's wrote a number of books on death and dying and other topics. And one of the questions he was asked in one of the sessions was about First Nations reconciliation in Canada. And he made an interesting point in reference to that specific thing, which I think deserves to be made in a larger way, not just specific to that. And what he said was, we keep trotting out the language of reconciliation as if there was a first time that we were reconciled. Do you see the twist here? And we've done the same thing in South Africa. They were called the Truth and Reconciliation Committees. Was there ever truly a conciliation to begin with? Why is that important? Well, since we're talking about Brené Brown today, another one of her favorite concepts that I like is the FFT. Now, if you've read her work, you know that I'm not going to say the first F, but it's freaking first times. And the idea is that, look, the first time you have to do something new, it is hard. You don't know what you're doing. You don't have any experience to draw on that's directly related. You've just got sort of your general life experience and your approach, and you just kind of got to dive in and figure it out, right? Am I right? Yeah, like we drive somewhere new even for the first time, and it feels like it takes 3 times longer, and the second time you drive there, you're like, yeah, that was nothing. I don't know why. Why was that so weird the first time, right? That's just an FFT. But here's the thing. When we suggest that racial healing in the United States is something we're redoing, we're telling a lie. We've never had racial justice. It's not a redo of something we successfully did in the past that we're trying to recreate, and we can look back at how we did it the first time. It is, we are trying to be reconciled as all God's children for the first time. And that is why it's so hard. Does that make sense to y'all? This isn't a redo, what we're doing right now. This global world where we're interconnected by technology and able to jump on a plane and be anywhere else in the world in a matter of hours. This is not a redo. This is the first time that we're forced to confront our universal siblinghood with every other human being on this planet in a way that is not abstract. The first time. And it is hard. Lordy, is it hard. But I really like the beliefs of my culture. And I really like saying that my culture is right. And can I just make your culture wrong? Well, you can, but you're avoiding the moment that we're in instead of stepping into it. The invitation in this moment is not to ask whether you get to make other people wrong. The curious question is, how did their people, how did your siblings who you didn't grow up with, how did their answers lead to different insights for them than the ones that you were privy to because of the background you came from? This idea that you've got something to learn from each other, that you've got something to teach each other, that your siblinghood is not a construction or a fantasy, it is a fact of your existence. Now, some of us, due to our families of origin, have experienced both harmonious and extremely disharmonious forms of siblinghood. Sometimes both within an hour of each other. So siblinghood is hard. We know that, right? We know that being up in somebody's space and having them up in our space and having them know which buttons of ours really get us going, that's creates a dangerous moment. But that is the vulnerability. We can't help it when we're with our family. We don't have to choose to disclose to our family, hey, that's a tender spot right there. They know, because they were there when we got the scar, right? So we don't have to tell them, oh, that's where I'm vulnerable. They know, and if you push them in their tender spot and they push you back in your tender spot, you're vulnerable whether you want to be or not. In case you've ever been curious about the theoretical basis for why it's so much harder to be with your family than your friends. Because with your friends, you get to choose your level of vulnerability. Well, I haven't revealed to them this thing from my past. So they might wander across it accidentally, but they can't poke you there on purpose. Not until you choose. All right. So I want to invite us into the idea that this moment is both as hard as it feels and as novel as it feels. Because we keep using that re-prefix on almost everything. We had Reconstruction after the Civil War. We never finished building a just union in the first place. We never built one to go back to. So it's not Reconstruction, it's just construction. And it's first-time construction, because the thing that we built the first time wasn't just. It didn't meet the standards. It didn't meet our own self-espoused standards for justice. And we know when we look around at the world today, it's still true, right? I don't think that the idea that the U.S. is 5% of the population and 25% of the world's prison population, that's not a just thing. It's not a just thing to imprison that many of your own people. Something's wrong with the system. And something's not wrong with the people trapped in the system. Hate to tell you. I know it's easier to blame them than blame us, but we're all implicated, and I'm not excluding myself. We are implicated. So, this gets us back to our topic from last week, why we picked this What It Takes to Heal congregational read. Because we can't architect an FFT of this magnitude until we're ready to show up different. We have to show up to that fresh moment with new eyes and an open heart, willing to be vulnerable, in order to imagine a first iteration of what a just world looks like. But I think we can. I've read a lot of folks. I read too much. You guys know I'm starting a graduate program next month. I have 6 books assigned for the semester. I'm already done reading 2 of them because that's just what kind of nerd I am. But that's all right. All right. So the first line in this new benediction is one you're already familiar with. Questions more profound than answers. Let's trouble ourselves to define profound for a minute. Showing great insight. The questions you ask may show much deeper and greater insight than the answers you think you already know. I think that's pretty cool. I think that's worth some contemplation. Let me share with you this quote from Rilke. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then, gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. I'm suggesting to you that whatever you imagine as a just world is the answer. And how do I heal is the question that puts your foot on the path.
I've said this before from this pulpit, and you'll hear me say it a bunch. For those of us in the middle and later years of life, the choice is very simple and a bit stark. Either we heal from the traumas we were dealt in this life, or we pass them on to the next generation. So the next time you think, oh, that's too hard, I don't want to deal with that, I know I'm still triggered about it, but can't I just put up a caution tape? Hey, if you're in my family or in my friend circle, just don't go inside the caution tape and we'll be fine. You can. You can. But that thing inside the caution tape ain't sitting still. It's like an iceberg. There's the part of it you can see, and then there's the continuing accumulation of more and more ice. And pretty soon, your orange tape's a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. Any of you been friends with some older folks who became more and more rigid and bitter the older they got? No? Yes? Yeah. That's that iceberg. They didn't want to deal with it, and they thought, well, I'll just fence it off. But it don't sit still. It keeps growing and growing until instead of being an iceberg in the ocean, it is the tundra landscape of your hopeless life. And everything's a trigger. Everything sets you off because you did not do your life's work. The work in front of you is to confront and heal your own traumas and to model how to heal those traumas for the next generation. That's your work. That's the work of moving from midlife to wise elderhood. I will be inviting you over and over again to that work. That work is what makes questions more profound than answers. And it's hard. I've admitted from here 6 weeks ago about yelling at my son in the car, and I did it yesterday. Ugh! It's not easy. It is much easier to talk about this stuff than it is to practice it. I don't want you to feel like I'm talking at you or down to you. I am in struggle every day to live what I'm preaching, and I fail. And luckily, I learn more from the failures than from the days that are smooth. The failures aren't a sign that you're getting it wrong. The fact that you noticed the failure is a sign that there's a chance you could get it right. So, anybody else in the room want to beat themselves up when they fail? Anybody? Oh, yeah, that's some good honesty right there. So, what if your failure is not a cause for self-flagellation, but an acknowledgement that your awareness has grown enough that you recognize that the thing you did wasn't okay? Without that recognition, there's no opportunity to heal that thing. There's no opportunity to make a repair with the person whose relationship you just injured. There's no chance. Anybody know any oblivious people who hurt people all the time and just seem, whoop? Yeah. See, that was you if you didn't notice. If you didn't notice that you hurt somebody, if you didn't notice that you did wrong, you're the oblivious person. And the chances for them to find a way out of that behavior pattern are teeny tiny compared to you. You did it, and then at least had the good sense to kind of be like, oh, yeah, that wasn't right. That wasn't how I want to show up in the world. That wasn't how I want to be in the world. Right? So it's a blessing. It's a blessing to fail if we're able to be aware of it. All right, moving to the second stanza. Play more proficient than mastery. Play more proficient than mastery. I wrote something last night. It seemed clever, so it probably isn't. Proficient means skilled. It means to be very good at something. And the thought that occurred to me is to become an expert at beginner's luck. I want to become an expert at beginner's luck. There are a lot of FFTs out there. And I want to get good at good first guesses. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. We've talked about So just to double down on this beginner luck idea, when you're new to something, at first you just focus because you don't know enough to overthink it. You show up to the game and you're like, I don't expect to win. I don't expect to do that well. What's the main objective? What part of the rule system can I fit in my head real quick, and let's just go try it and have some fun with it, right? And then suddenly you're like, ooh, maybe I could be good at this. What if I move my wrist like this? What if I move my wrist like that? Right? And then we start doing what we see in sports training, which is you get a plateau and then a decrease in performance, and then you hit a new plateau, right? So it's well documented in literature about sports performance that you should expect both plateaus and dips in performance right before you make a big breakthrough in technique or in physical training or in anything, right? So when we're a beginner, though, it's before all that, and it's just straight up, which feels real good. So we've talked about play as the most natural form of learning. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that when we're truly playing, we are in a joyful place. And for the purposes of this example, we'll say that the opposite of joy is that anxiety thing that we talked about. Anybody here do their best learning when they're anxious? Anybody here do their best learning when they're angry? Oh man, those things are all and always distractions. They're always distractions. It's always a moment where you're like, oh, if I wasn't feeling anxious, I could do this problem better. But you're like, but I can't take my hand off the grindstone. I just got to keep. No, take your hand off the grindstone. Go meditate for 2 minutes, come back. It will make a difference. It will matter to how you're able to show up to that thing and how you're able to let the thing that you're doing teach you. Everything we do is a teacher in this life, if we let it be. But we have to show up that way. We have to show up rested and nourished and not triggered 9 ways to Sunday in order to learn what that moment in life is trying to teach us. All right, mastery. Well, maybe the thing that'll get improved about this later is something other than mastery. I don't know. I struggled with what I wanted to point at with this use of the word mastery is the idea that what you know is more important than your curiosity. Mastery as an end to learning is what I'm trying to evoke here with the use of the word mastery, right? Oh, I'm already a pro at that. I don't need to learn anything else. Ain't nobody that pro about nothing. So the version of mastery that I want to evoke when I use it in this phrase is this idea that you now have nothing to learn from anybody else. That you've taken on that kind of level of seriousness about your own accomplishment. The seriousness is just another form of what Brené Brown calls armor. It's just another way to shut yourself off and protect yourself. It's not an authentic acknowledgement of your accomplishments. What we find in true masters, as opposed to the idea of mastery, is that they have the most questions. True masters recognize that there is no end to the path of craft that they are on. You see it in woodworkers or sculptors who are like, well, what are you going to make? Well, I won't know until the piece of material gets here. It's a conversation between me and that beautiful thing that exists only once in the universe. We have to have a conversation about what shape is inside it. And that conversation will be informed by my spirit and my mind and my history and my aspirations. But it will be equally informed by the miracle of stardust that thing is. That's what you see in people who I would call actual masters. But masters traffic in humility, not mastery. All right. Third stanza. Vulnerability more powerful than invincibility. Now, you'll notice I replaced the word strength with invincibility because I think this gets at what Brené is trying to teach us through her work. Invincibility is the idea that you can get enough armor on that no one can hurt you. And I've seen people who get pretty armored up, pretty good at it. There happens to be a big Venn diagram overlap between those folks and the folks we talked about who hurt people without noticing. Right? But you can do it. But here's the thing. When you're inside all that armor, you are alone. You're alone. You've cut yourself off from human relationship with your siblings, with your family. If no one can hurt you, you're denying that there's a shared humanity there that matters. You're denying that anyone who you love or care about or who loves or cares about you really matters to you. You'd rather stay safe than stay connected. That's what armor does. That's what 30 years of Brené Brown research has revealed pretty comprehensively. So vulnerability is being willing to take the armor off and show up for each other. I'm going to tell you right now, it's something ministers are warned against, I think. Every one of your opinions matters to me. Every one of you could hurt me with a word. You matter to me, deeply. I feel the responsibility of sitting up here in front of you keenly. I don't want to come up here armored up and preach at you somebody else's wisdom. I want to show up in struggle with you so we can all get better together. That's the Bodhisattva vow. So, at one stage in human spiritual evolution, there was this idea of monasticism, right? In order for you to attain your highest level, you had to go hide yourself away, right? And I don't want to denigrate that. We learned some important things from monastic practitioners. I can tell you that one of the important inflection points on my path was getting to see the Dalai Lama in person. The energy he radiated was real and palpable and spiritual. And I was I was a basketball stadium away from him. I was in the nosebleeds at the old O'Connell Center. No, it wasn't. It was the one they just tore down here at UT, the Longhorn one. O'Connell's back where I did my undergrad. Anyway, but monastics paid a price. They cut off part of themselves. They cut off part of the totality of being human in order to get this uneven development. Our task, the task that I see for humanity at this phase in our evolution, is to level up. We got to level up. We've got to take those who have taken the intellectual path at the expense of the emotional and spiritual path and what they've accomplished. And we've got to take those who have taken the emotional path at the experience of the intellectual and spiritual path and incorporate their wisdom. We've got to take the people who became spiritual geniuses at the neglect of the other two. And we got to figure out a way to do it together so that we're becoming smarter, both intellectually and emotionally, and spiritually more able to connect with each other and connect to the divinity that is the life and love that creates what we are. So that's the challenge. In Buddhism, they call it being a householder. We are holding and building the houses of our village together. All right. Vulnerability is the cornerstone of human connection. The willingness to be vulnerable is how we express trust. The willingness to be with others when they are vulnerable is how we earn trust. Trust is human connection. All right, next bullet. Supplication, more productive than control. Supplication. Supplicate suggests a posture of humility. This one ties into number 2 that we talked about. The definition of supplication that I learned did not come from a book or the internet, but from my own spiritual vision quest process. Supplication is the humble surrender to what is. The parts of it that bring you joy, the parts of it that break your heart. All of it. The root of the word is supple, to be bendable. Its opposite is brittle. You know the old saw, the supple branch bends and twists in the wind, but does not break. The vicissitudes of life are that wind, and your suppleness is all that stands between you and your destruction. There is a deeper spiritual meaning for me to the one that led me to this pulpit, a surrender to the call, a surrender to one's own purpose or daimon, or to that larger purpose that we sometimes call God, a God whose voice whispers our own purposes into our ears. Maybe it comes to us in a vision or a dream, maybe through a neighbor. You see, we're all implicated. None of us are truly free or individual. We're interrelated to each other in deep ways that we simply don't notice most of the time. What is control? It's a lauded word in our culture, but for those of us who are on a growing and healing path, well, usually it's an issue. He or she has control issues. Anybody know anybody with control issues? All right. I won't make you raise your hands on that one. It's too obvious. So these things all overlap and interrelate with each other, right? Control issues and armor are deeply related, right? Control is the shield that you carry on your arm of the armor that Brene Brown talks about. Right? It is the thing that you use. If I can keep people in line doing just what I expect, then I don't have to learn anything new about what's happening out there. I can just keep doing my thing. Just leave me alone so I can keep doing my thing. Maybe if I hold still, the iceberg won't grow. Psych! You can hold still all you want, that iceberg ain't gonna stop. It ain't gonna stop growing because you stopped noticing it for a little while. As a matter of fact, your attention is the only thing that melts it. All right. I don't think I need to beat the dead horse of control any further, although I'll rely on you to tell me if I'm wrong about that when we do reflections. Now, this last line, a peace that passeth all understanding, I already preached on that for 40 minutes or so, so I won't beat that one to death, but I will share this story from Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth. Sri Krishnamurti, the great Indian philosopher and spiritual teacher, spoke and traveled almost continually all over the world for more than 50 years, attempting to convey through words, which are content, that which is beyond words, beyond content. At one of his talks in the later part of his life, he surprised his audience by saying, "Do you want to know my secret?" Everyone became very alert. Many people in the audience had been coming to listen to him for 20 or 30 years and still failed to grasp the essence of his teaching. Finally, after all these years, the master would give them the key to understanding. "This is my secret," he said. "I don't mind what happens." He did not elaborate, and so I suspect most of his audience were even more perplexed than before. The implications of this simple statement, however, are profound. I don't mind what happens. I don't think he's saying I don't let it enter my awareness. I don't think he's saying I deny attention to what happens. I think what he's pointing at is I don't form an opinion. I don't form a reaction to what happens. I notice. Here's something that I learned from being a manager of people for many years. I'm not interested in incidents. I'm interested in patterns. I'm not interested in incidents. They happen. I'm interested in patterns. I'm not interested in the first time you show up late to work or late to a meeting. That stuff happens. The third time in 1 month that you show up late to a meeting or late to work, now we have a pattern worth investigating. What's going on for you? That's something worth getting curious about. But notice, I said curious and not judgmental. I think this is what J. Krishnamurti is getting at. Even when we notice a pattern that needs intervention, it doesn't mean that we suddenly have permission to judge first and ask questions later. If we're coming from a place of love, the first thing that should get activated in us is a curiosity about the other human being. Bill, you've skipped the last 3 meetings, man. What's going on? Help me understand. Like I didn't hear from you. And are you doing okay? Is there something going on in your life that I need to understand so that we can be on the same page again? Open-ended questions, curious questions. Let the other person tell you why the worst idea that you had in your head is or isn't true about what their motives were or what was happening in their life. How many Ted Lasso viewers are there in the audience? All right. If you didn't raise your hand, I do not like to shill products from the pulpit, but I am telling you that a 1-month subscription to Apple TV so that you can go binge Ted Lasso from end to end is worth your time spiritually. So, in the last season of Ted Lasso, a guy who'd really struggled with his own emotional intelligence tells a brilliant story about a former teammate of his. And I won't spoil it too much, but what he says is, look, none of us know what's going on in each other's lives. None of us know what's going on in the other person's life. That's why we give each other grace. We get curious enough to find out, but we're not entitled to know, right? Getting curious and having the other person say, I really don't want to talk about it, I'm not ready to share. It's enough. You've just answered one of your questions. Is it serious enough that they deserve some compassion from me? If they won't talk about it, it probably is. You're not entitled to that information. But getting curious is a deep way of expressing care. Getting curious is a deep way of expressing your care for another human being. Hey, what's going on with you? Do you have a minute to talk about it? So, I think I've preached from this pulpit before a story from Stephen Jenkinson's book where one of his soul teachers, Brother Blue, encourages him to pick somebody in the third row and play to them all night at a show, at a performance, and says, if you could see what that one person has been through in their life, from their earliest days, everything that got them into that seat tonight, you would fall down on your knees and there would never be another stranger. Are you willing to extend that grace to everybody? And I mean everybody. Even the ones about whom you have hardened opinions. Even about the ones who you believe have earned that hardened opinion. Are they not the most damaged among us? Is there any hope for them but love? All right. Well, at least at the end of today, when I say, may you find questions more profound than answers, play more proficient than mastery, vulnerability more powerful than invincibility, supplication more productive than control, and a peace that passeth all understanding, you'll have some idea what I'm trying to be on about. Thank you.
Until next time, thank you for joining us on The Pulpiteer. The Pulpiteer podcast is a production of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Georgetown, Texas. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can make a donation at sangabrieluu.org/give. The podcast is hosted by Spotify, and theme music is by John Faber. The podcast is written, produced, and performed by Eric Hepburn.